2 hours ago, the White House made a territorial claim that defied geography, economics, and a century of international cooperation. President Trump signed an executive order declaring the St. Lawrence Seaway a critical American waterway subject to United States regulatory authority, demanding joint operational control with veto power over all vessel traffic, tolls, and infrastructure decisions. The justification? Canada's control over the locks and channels gives it unfair trade leverage over American commerce. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent called it a necessary correction to an outdated agreement that allows Canada to extract economic rent from American ships accessing their own Great Lakes ports. The executive order demands immediate negotiations to establish American oversight or face unspecified economic consequences. But this was not about fairness. This was about control. The St. Lawrence Seaway is the only navigable connection between the Great Lakes and the Atlantic Ocean. Without it, ships cannot reach Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Milwaukee, or any of the dozens of ports that move $200 billion in cargo annually. Canada controls the locks, the channels, and the regulations. And Trump just demanded they hand over that control. The White House expected Canada to negotiate. They expected concern about economic disruption to force Ottawa into compromise. They expected this to be resolved quietly through diplomatic channels while Trump claimed a win. Mark Carney responded in 60 minutes. What he announced has sent every manufacturing executive in the Great Lakes region into absolute panic and left Washington staring at an economic crisis in the exact swing states Trump cannot afford to lose. He orders impossible demand. Let's be absolutely clear about what this executive order actually demands. It does not ask for consultation or coordination. It demands that Canada surrender sovereign control over infrastructure entirely within Canadian territory because American ships use it to access American ports. The order has 3 components. First, it establishes a joint U.S.-Canada Seaway Authority with American veto power over toll rates, vessel scheduling, and infrastructure maintenance decisions. Second, it requires Canada to submit all operational changes to American approval, including lock maintenance schedules that could temporarily restrict traffic. Third, it threatens unspecified trade restrictions if Canada does not agree to negotiations within 30 days. For context, the St. Lawrence Seaway is not shared territory. The locks and channels in Canadian waters are Canadian infrastructure, built and maintained by Canada, operating under Canadian law. American ships pay tolls to use them, just as Canadian ships pay tolls to use the Panama Canal. What Trump just demanded is equivalent to Panama handing the United States veto power over canal operations because American ships are frequent customers. The White House assumed Canada would balk publicly but negotiate privately. They assumed economic dependency would force compromise. They assumed this would follow the familiar pattern where American pressure eventually produces Canadian concessions. They were catastrophically wrong. Washington's geographic ignorance. The Trump administration's strategy revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of Great Lakes geography and economics. They assumed threatening trade restrictions would give America leverage. But Canada does not need the Seaway for its own commerce. The United States does. The Great Lakes contain 8 American states and 2 Canadian provinces. But the only navigable route to the ocean runs through Canadian waters. The Welland Canal bypasses Niagara Falls. The locks at the St. Lawrence allow ships to navigate from Lake Ontario to the Atlantic. Every single lock, every single control point sits in Canadian territory. American ports move massive volumes of cargo. Iron ore from Minnesota, grain from Wisconsin, steel from Indiana, automobiles from Michigan. All of it depends on ships reaching the ocean through Canadian-controlled infrastructure. If those locks close, Great Lakes ports become economically landlocked. The cargo still exists, but moving it by rail or truck costs 4 to 5 times more and takes far longer. Washington expected Canada to fear American retaliation. But Carney understood something the White House clearly did not. In this particular dispute, Canada held all the leverage because Canada controlled the only route that mattered. Carney streitek kenakuyut. Here's what Carney actually did. 60 minutes after the executive order went public, he walked into an emergency session of Parliament. He carried a single folder. He looked directly into the camera and said 9 words that made every CEO in the Great Lakes region reach for the phone. Canada does not negotiate sovereignty over Canadian territory. Then he announced 3 immediate actions. First, effective immediately, the St. Lawrence Seaway is closed to all commercial vessel traffic pending a comprehensive review of operational security and treaty compliance, not reduced capacity.
Closed.
Every lock, every channel, every navigable route through Canadian waters shut down until further notice. The stated reason. If the United States believes Canadian control poses risks to American commerce, Canada will conduct a full safety review before allowing any vessels to continue using Canadian infrastructure. Second, Canada is suspending the 1959 St. Lawrence Seaway Agreement that governs joint operations and cost sharing. Carney stated that if the United States questions Canadian authority over the Seaway, the legal framework establishing that authority no longer serves mutual interests. Canada would operate the Seaway under its own regulations when and if it chose to reopen. Third, Canada is immediately accelerating infrastructure investments to redirect Great Lakes shipping through exclusively Canadian ports. Thunder Bay, Ontario, would receive emergency funding to expand capacity. Rail connections from Canadian Great Lakes ports to Hudson Bay would be fast-tracked. The goal was to ensure Canadian commerce could bypass American waters entirely. Carney closed with a statement aimed directly at American business leaders. The St. Lawrence Seaway is Canadian infrastructure in Canadian waters operating under Canadian law. It has been open to American vessels for decades as a gesture of cooperation and mutual benefit. That cooperation requires mutual respect. When respect ends, cooperation ends. Your government demanded control. Canada chooses closure. He walked away without taking questions. Within 15 minutes, the first ships approaching the Seaway received notifications. The locks were closed. Transit was suspended indefinitely. The Great Lakes economic collapse begins. The impact was immediate and absolutely devastating. The Great Lakes shipping season runs from late March through December. During peak season, over 160 million tons of cargo move through the Seaway annually. When the locks closed, that entire system froze. Iron ore shipments from Minnesota to steel mills in Indiana stopped immediately. Those mills operate on just-in-time inventory. Within 72 hours, blast furnaces began shutting down because they had no raw material. Steel production across the Great Lakes region dropped 40% in the first week. Grain elevators in Wisconsin and Michigan were full of wheat, corn, and soybeans waiting for export. The harvest season had just ended. Farmers had sold their crops to exporters who planned to ship through the Seaway to international markets. With the locks closed, that grain sat in storage. Prices collapsed. Farmers faced defaults on equipment loans because they could not deliver sold inventory. Automobile manufacturers faced a different crisis. Finished vehicles are often shipped by freighter from Detroit and other Great Lakes assembly plants to East Coast ports for export. When the Seaway closed, automakers had two choices: halt exports or move vehicles by rail at 5 times the cost. Either option destroyed profit margins on international sales. The Port of Chicago processes over 20 million tons of cargo annually, including steel, grain, and heavy machinery. When the Seaway closed, every ship scheduled for Atlantic destinations was stranded. Port operations ground to a halt. Longshoremen, truckers, warehouse workers all faced immediate layoffs. One port authority director told the Chicago Tribune, "We are not talking about delays. We are talking about complete stoppage. Ships cannot reach the ocean. Cargo cannot move. This is not a disruption. This is economic shutdown. A swing state, political catastrophe." Now here is why the White House is in absolute freefall. The Great Lakes region includes Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, all swing states. All states Trump won in previous elections. All states where economic performance directly influences voter behavior. Michigan's economy depends on automobile manufacturing and steel. When auto exports stop and steel mills shut down, unemployment spikes. The United Auto Workers immediately issued a statement blaming the administration for provoking an unnecessary crisis. Union leadership, traditionally cautious about political confrontation, called the executive order economic malpractice that put Michigan jobs at risk for no reason. Wisconsin farmers watched grain prices collapse and faced the prospect of rotting inventory because ships could not reach export markets. The Wisconsin Farm Bureau, which had supported Trump in past elections, released a statement demanding immediate resolution. One farmer told local media, "I voted for this guy because he said he would help American agriculture. Now, I cannot sell my crop because he picked a fight with Canada over a canal they own." Ohio steel workers saw mills shut down and faced furloughs because iron ore could not reach furnaces. The United Steelworkers Union warned that prolonged closure would result in permanent job losses as customers shifted to foreign suppliers who could still deliver. Pennsylvania ports on Lake Erie faced immediate operational shutdowns. Longshoremen, truckers, and logistics workers in Erie saw paychecks disappear overnight. Local elected officials, including Republican state legislators, began publicly questioning why the administration targeted infrastructure that Pennsylvania jobs depended on. These were not Democratic activists. These were Trump voters, union members, farmers, and industrial workers in states he needed to win. And they were watching their livelihoods evaporate because of an executive order demanding control over Canadian territory. The American business revolt. The response from American industry was swift and furious. Within 24 hours, the Great Lakes Maritime Alliance, representing shipping companies, port authorities, and cargo handlers, called for immediate rescission of the executive order. Their statement noted that demanding sovereign control over another nation's infrastructure is not negotiation, it is provocation, and American workers are paying the price. U.S. Steel issued a rare public statement criticizing government policy. They projected that prolonged Seaway closure would force blast furnace shutdowns across multiple facilities, resulting in thousands of layoffs and billions in lost production. One executive told the Wall Street Journal, "We operate on the assumption that the St. Lawrence Seaway remains open because it has been open for 65 years. Shutting it down over a territorial dispute destroys the entire Great Lakes manufacturing ecosystem." General Motors and Ford both released statements expressing alarm. GM noted that vehicle exports through Great Lakes ports represented $8 billion in annual revenue. Ford warned that prolonged disruption would force production cuts at multiple assembly plants. The agriculture lobby was even more direct. The American Farm Bureau Federation called the executive order a self-inflicted wound that threatens rural livelihoods across the Midwest. Grain exporters projected losses exceeding $15 billion if the closure extended through the harvest season. These were not Canadian voices. These were American companies, American unions, and American trade associations telling their own government that demanding control over Canadian infrastructure had backfired catastrophically. The International Legal Response. Canada's legal position was airtight, and the international community knew it. The St. Lawrence Seaway operates under a 1959 bilateral agreement that explicitly recognizes Canadian sovereignty over infrastructure in Canadian waters. The agreement establishes cost-sharing and operational coordination, but it does not grant the United States any authority over Canadian decision-making. Canada immediately filed formal notifications with the International Court of Justice and the Permanent Court of Arbitration, not requesting rulings, but placing on record that the United States had demanded territorial concessions under economic duress. The filings included transcripts of the executive order and Carney's response, creating a permanent legal record. The United Kingdom issued a statement supporting the sovereign right of nations to control infrastructure within their own territory. The language was diplomatic, but the implication was clear. Britain was siding with Canada. The European Union went further. The European Commission noted that demanding operational control over another nation's infrastructure as a condition of trade represents a violation of principles underlying international commerce. That was not just commentary. That was a signal that Europe viewed American demands as setting a dangerous precedent. Even Mexico, cautious about antagonizing Washington, released a carefully worded statement expressing concern about unilateral demands that infringe on national sovereignty. The subtext was obvious. If the United States could demand control over Canadian waterways, they could demand the same over Mexican infrastructure. Trump's impossible choice. So where does this leave the White House? 3 options, all disastrous. Option 1. Maintain the demand and watch the Great Lakes economy collapse. Steel mills shut down permanently. Farmers default on loans. Auto exports halt. Ports close. Unemployment spikes in Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Every single one a swing state. Every single voter blaming Trump for an economic crisis that started with an executive order demanding control over Canadian territory. Option 2. Quietly withdraw the demand and reopen negotiations. That admits the entire strategy was a catastrophic miscalculation. It hands Carney a complete victory and proves to every other nation that American threats are hollow when allies control critical leverage points. It also enrages the political base that was told this was about American strength. Option 3. Escalate with additional economic pressure on Canada. That pushes Canada to make the Seaway closure permanent and invest in alternative routes that bypass American waters entirely. It also guarantees that Great Lakes businesses, unions, and farmers become permanently hostile political forces. None of these options deliver what Trump wanted. He wanted Canada to surrender control over the Seaway. Instead, he got an economic shutdown in states he cannot afford to lose, a unified business community demanding reversal, and international legal condemnation. T. deeper strategic failure. What should genuinely terrify the White House is that Canada did not improvise this response. The legal filings were prepared in advance. The infrastructure investments in alternative routes were already budgeted. The political messaging was coordinated with precision. Canada knew this pressure was coming. They identified the Seaway as a likely American target because it represented visible Canadian control over something Americans needed. And they built a response that turned that control into a weapon that hurt American interests far more than Canadian ones. One senior Canadian transport official told the Globe and Mail anonymously, "We have known for months that the administration was looking at the Seaway. We ran the scenarios. We realized that closure hurt American ports more than Canadian commerce. So we prepared to do exactly what we did. We did not need the Seaway. They did. We just made sure they understood that." 2 hours ago, the White House thought it was demanding fair access to a shared waterway. 2 hours later, it triggered an economic crisis in 4 swing states, united American business and labor against its own policy, and proved that demanding sovereignty over another nation's territory produces immediate economic self-harm when that nation controls infrastructure you depend on. Trump wanted control over the St. Lawrence Seaway. He got closed locks, shuttered steel mills, bankrupt farmers, and furious voters in states he needs to win. He wanted to prove American strength. He proved that strength without strategy is just recklessness. He wanted Canada to surrender. He got an economics lesson in what happens when you demand control over something you need more than the country that owns it. Mark Carney did not negotiate. He did not compromise. He closed the locks and waited for reality to teach Washington what maps already showed. The only route from the Great Lakes to the ocean runs through Canada. And Canada just reminded America what sovereignty actually means.